Good evening, YouTube Live. Glad to see you on this amazing Sunday, October 9th. Want to talk about a few issues today on my YouTube Live today. One of them being the amazing writing of Russell Maroon Schultz. Shout out to his son, Russell III, on putting together with the whole Schultz family an amazing memorial for the work of CADBI, which is a group dedicated to communicating with political prisoners. And I met some amazing political prisoners. And congratulations to Yane Indigo on organizing an amazing brunch for families of political prisoners. So shout out to Yane and Russell Maroon Schultz, the son of Russell Maroon Schultz, on an amazing brunch. I wanted to just look at the excerpt of what they provided at this amazing brunch, an excerpt of Maroon's work, and particularly from which has impacted me. You see, um, the torn, tattered book, because I've taken a lot of notes. I learned so much about Jamaican Maroons that I never knew before because of Russell Maroon Schultz. Please, if you're just joining this, like, share, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. This is my 19th one, and uh, if you're so inclined and have learned information, don't hesitate to give to my Cash App, which is $Roan Fraser. Make sure you also read the work of Russell Maroon Schultz. Very inspiring. He really looks at history from the colonized point of view. It definitely gives the energy of the French Martinican, Frantz Fanon's Les Dommes de la Terre in French, but in English, The Wretched of the Earth. You really get the perspective of resistance from the perspective of not only revolutionaries, but from the Maroon perspective, the Jamaican Maroons. I learned so much about the Jamaican Maroons, the Windward, Queen Nanny Kojo from Russell Maroon Schultz. So thank you. This excerpt that I just want to look at of what his family provided uh, at his brunch. He passed last year. Um, he had, an advanced stage of cancer, and the state of Pennsylvania chose to release him right when that final stage arrived, instead of giving him the medical treatment that he needed. But one thing that the state of Pennsylvania, despite incarcerating him for decades in solitary confinement, it's so inhumane in my mind that a prison complex like ours can incarcerate a man in solitary confinement, but that still did not destroy Maroon's spirit, Maroon's ability to write, Maroon's ability to understand history, Maroon's ability to communicate that understanding of history. Was not destroyed or ended because of his inhumane, a clear violation of the Eighth Amendment of the US Constitution. Despite him, Maroon, being subjected to cruel and unusual punishment and being forced to be in solitary confinement for decades, he has produced some of the most amazing, life-changing literature for me. And this is what his family gave out at his service, recognizing his work. This is from The Dragon and the Hydra Revisited. And the dragon is, the colonizer, like Caliban in Shakespeare's play The Tempest. And the Hydra is the resistance. And so that is a very strong metaphor Maroon writes in this book, Maroon the Implacable. Maroon writes, what are some of the useful lessons we can learn from the fighting Maroons? First and foremost, they serve to give us courage, something that is sorely needed by a severely demoralized global multitude, which has received so many blows. Many are now all but convinced that capital or imperialism is essentially all powerful. And you hear it in expressions by, oh, you better not do that. And like Malcolm X, when the way we even talk about Malcolm X's life, this statement by Maroon here forced me to really reevaluate how I look at Spike Lee's film. And the way he looked at it is that I think subconsciously Spike Lee gives the message that imperialism is all powerful by the very brutal and violent way Spike Lee shows Malcolm X's death, and the way he ends it, it's like it's final. There's nothing else he ever did. When as a playwright, I'm an original stage playwright. So I'm constantly looking at the ways that people's message doesn't only stay within their generation. People's message, such as Malcolm's message, is carried on to the younger generations. And one of the filmmakers that did that incredibly is Nate Parker. I was just complimenting his film on Nat Turner to a colleague of mine. What I love about Nate Parker's film, and it's very much become the seed of my sixth play, is the way that Nate Parker showed that young little boy who became an informant against Nat Turner, but how that young little boy grew up to be a Union soldier in the end who was fighting for the end of chattel slavery. I just appreciated that through line and Nate Parker's deliberate showing that Nat Turner's message of abolition carried to the younger generation. Malcolm X's message of freedom from imperialist domination carried to the younger generation, as did Marcus Garvey's message, as did Maroon's message. Moreover, Maroon writes, the demoralized sea of humankind, and notice how he spells humankind to incorporate men and women, and this spelling incorporates non-binary as well. Humankind, Humynkind, has all but come to believe that capital imperialism is destined to defeat, subjugate, exploit, and or co-opt everyone and or everything it chooses. And I'm thinking immediately of the mainstream parties, the Democratic Party co-opting the free breakfast program that was originated by the Black Panther Party in order to enlarge its power. And the all too apparent historic capitulations of even the nominally socialist, and he puts that in quotes and they need to be, socialist dragons further drove home this message. And we have to be careful on who's calling something socialism, just as we have to be critical of who's calling something Black. Yet, Maroon writes, the history of the most successful fighting Maroons shows that they never played by capital imperialism's rules. That's lesson number 2, Maroon writes. First, if that is true, then seeking to oppose their system by relying strictly on building a traditional nation state will always place you, the reader, at a material, technological disadvantage if you don't have the cell phone, if you don't have the latest, in John Brown's time, cable communique to communicate to your collaborators on how you plan to execute. And if your opponents do have the technological advantage, such as walkie-talkies or a way to communicate with their forces, then you're at a disadvantage, Maroon writes, which could take you centuries to overcome, exclamation point. This is a period of time that today's capital imperialist dominated world with its accompanying ecocide guarantees will not be available. Our 21st century fighting Maroon style organizations and communities must seek Maroon rights to avoid the traditional nation state trap and prevent ecocide. Instead, they must develop a system of intercommunal self-determination, the rudimentary outlines of which are laid out in the Dragon and Hydra essay. Even so, such a process will more than likely, if successful, have to pass through a stage where its fighting Maroon Hydra forces will have to eradicate the reactionary dragons of capital imperialism before temporarily seizing state power. Perhaps through the sheer fighting, Maroon style, and staying power, coupled with the temporary concessions wrung from truncated states, it will move aggressively forward to more fully eradicate the inherent nation state with its propensity to serve as an oppressive instrument of class rule. This is something which our discussion laments the early socialists were never able to accomplish, as they idealistically believed in the certainty of the withering away of the state that their early leaders wrote about. So Maroon is showing himself here as somebody who did not believe in the ability of the state to be nothing but an oppressive instrument of class rule. That's something that I personally struggle with. I always believe the state can be used to prevent class oppression. It can be used in that regard. Whether it has been in human history is absolutely up for debate. And what is also up for debate is the varying degrees to which such states such as Haiti, such as Cuba, in their revolution did prevent or barely prevent or slightly prevent class oppression through the state. But I appreciate Maroon really raising these prescient arguments. Make sure you read Maroon the Implacable. Maroon the Implacable. This discussion he mentions here, Maroon, of the nation state and its propensity to serve as an oppressive instrument of class rule brings me to the amazing CLR James, which brings me to Kanye's slogan that everybody is talking about. But Kanye, being the businessman that he is promoting his clothing brand. This is the excerpt I have up here of this book, The Pan-African Connection, edited by Tony Martin. This particular page, what Tony Martin is doing is comparing, describing the themes of the writer CLR James. And for CLR James, class was more important than race. A lot of our headlines today, even the Supreme Court oral arguments about the Alabama redistricting, involves race. The discussion of it is concerned with race. The discussion is bogged down, I would say bogged down, but is highly preoccupied, highly concerned, highly interested in this racial question. Does more oppression happen racially or by class? And what Tony Martin says of CLR James is there is more class oppression than there is race oppression. I'm really trying to find the complete, yes, it's right here on this page. Yes. This is Tony Martin talking about CLR James. James felt the need to qualify the statement. He hastened to explain that this was not racism, talking about the work of H. Rap Brown. Furthermore, he assured his audience that racism was on the decline in the United States anyway. And this is up for argument because even though you have a Black president and many Black millionaires and now billionaires, there is an argument that racism no longer exists, but we still see, for the most part, a class struggle happening where the academic gap, as we see from the data from the various foundations talking about the achievement gap that still exists between white families and Black families. Martin says of James, what was on the increase was Black people fighting police rather than white people fighting Black people. This tendency to consign racism as a premature demise was evident as early as 1939 and is a trait which crops up from time to time in the works of Marxists. And that's what he puts him in that category. Martin puts James in that Marxist category. But I think there's something to be said about the class question and how individuals should not be dismissed. I said this in my analysis of the 1619 Project, and I mentioned how it's a history that we should know, but it's also a history that should not convince us that in history, all the Black people were victims and all the white people were oppressors. That is the danger of seeing class over race. Excuse me. That's the danger of seeing race over class, where all the problems, all the conflicts in human history are due to one's race. When more often than not, I think Tony Martin and CLR James makes the case that conflicts in history happen more often, not so much because of race, but because of class. Please subscribe, share, and like my YouTube. If you just joined, this is my 19th YouTube Live. Glad to be on here. And you can also support my Cash App at $Ron Fraser. What I underline here in this excerpt from the Pan-African Connection, edited by Tony Martin, is Martin saying that the primacy of class over race being the primary conflict is, of course, common to all Marxists. And that was CLR James was. And I'm talking about CLR James because CLR James is the author of the masterpiece, the magnum opus, The Black Jacobins. Make sure you read The Black Jacobins, because what James, CLR James, the author, who was a professor in this city, Washington, D.C., right here at the University of District Columbia for many years, the Department of History, he taught. And there was a program that I noticed, a film that I noticed a scholar doing on him, and I'd love to see and support that film. I forget the scholar's name, but he is doing a film on CLR James's time at UDC. Professor Ackland Lynch, also, who is a retired professor from University of Maryland, Baltimore County, knew CLR James personally and has an amazing framed photograph of CLR James in his study. This putting class before race, it's not so much, it's a hard thing to do when we have all been inculcated, been programmed by the matrix to think that race is the primary determinant. You know, it's popular and it's hot to say we're all racially oppressed, but in certain cases it's not true. In certain cases it is not true. Many times race is used. I think Denzel Washington movie The Great Debaters showed that most clearly. Race is used as a tool to divide all working people, white working people, which there are many of. There are more white people on welfare than from Black working people. So we have to be aware of that and don't fall for the okie doke that we see all over social media, that all of the problems in the world are because of white people. It is absolutely not that simple. You have certain white people who are very helpful and instrumental to the cause. This is something George Jackson, the fellow Libran of mine, September 23rd Libra, wrote about. The idea that all Blacks are our allies and all whites are our enemies is lazy, he wrote. And that's what Tony Martin here is saying about CLR James. For CLR James, the primacy of class in James is common to him and to all Marxists. His impatience with those who emphasize the race aspect at the expense of a class analysis is also typical. But that's everything we see in this society. It's telling, especially those in the US, that all the problems are due to one's race. And it's simply not that simple. It's more class than race, arguably class over race in many cases. Several Black Marxists, including his friend George Padmore, have from time to time actually broken off their communist affiliations because as Black men, they found themselves attracted to the cause of Black solidarity, even at the expense of their Marxist training. Padmore was specifically charged with this offense, in his case deserting a class position to engage in a petty bourgeois pro-Liberia activity. Upon his expulsion from among the ranks of communists, James has also been less affected by this attraction than most, no doubt because he has always been a much more thoroughgoing Marxist than many, Black or white. Yet his record of participation in Black causes seems to suggest that for him, at least, there's been no insurmountable contradiction between, for him, James being a Marxist and being a Black man. And definitely supporting the cause of Black solidarity. And you definitely see this in James's comments about the Communist Party limitation, the U.S. Communist Party's limitation. Betty Metzger has written in her book, The Burglary, on the numerous ways that J. Edgar Hoover's FBI infiltrated the U.S. Communist Party and the Socialist Workers' Party in the 30s and 40s. So this is exactly why Garvey discouraged involvement in the U.S. Communist Party, because the heavy government infiltration inside of it. And Garvey was already very clear as a Black nationalist. One could argue that Garvey believed, like James, that it's class over race. You know, it's class that determines what we see about why conflicts happen. Especially with the canceling of Alex Jones and the way that notice that Alex Jones was canceled right after he began tweeting about Julian Assange, because those in the elite class knew that if the working class of white people became aware of and chose to sympathize with Assange the way that Alex Jones was, that could absolutely threaten the hegemony and social order. So when you see certain things and certain people being canceled, for me particularly, the canceling of Alex Jones was proof that it's not race over class in the US, it's class over race. The danger of Jones supporters even supporting Assange posed a serious threat to the status quo. And so this is why by the time we get to this photo of Kanye's new line saying white lives matter, well, for Kanye's life, white lives do matter. He married Kim Kardashian. So she is not, she is what you would call in the US the identity that her and her immigrants and her people tried to have when they arrived in the US is white. And that she has become the mother of his 4 children. So for him, white lives matter. But this is true on 2 other levels for me. One, how effective was Black Lives Matter in stopping police brutality is my question. I'm seeing so many angry comments that are clearly anger towards Kanye, when in my mind, we need to ask, it was an opportunity to ask the question, what is Black Lives Matter and its sloganeering doing for actually stopping the death of Black lives? Question mark. And for me, the answer is not enough. You know, I tweeted already how Kwame Brown asked a very important question of what happened to Colin Kaepernick. He took millions of dollars from Nike, and that seemed to be money that shut him up. Nike was also mentioned by Kanye West in his interview with Tucker Carlson. Um, Even though they're not in the top 5 earning the way that the Gap is as a company, they still participate in the silencing of militant voices at, well, what was once a militant voice by Colin Kaepernick. But we see how the corporate system responds by giving money as a way to quiet or silence the kind of protest Colin Kaepernick was making. So I believe Kwame Brown was absolutely right in asking, where is Kaepernick? And for me, when I noticed that he was receiving an honorary degree from Morgan State, I was like, for what? For taking Nike's money, for living a millionaire lifestyle after, it's because I applaud his effort to, take a knee, but I don't think that's merited a honorary degree from an HBCU. But I guess according to the board of trustees of Morgan State, he deserves one after getting $1 million already from Nike. I'm just putting this all in the context of Maroon, someone who is serious about teaching a particular kind of history and is particularly used to the ways in which capital is used to undermine. And Kanye's message is very clear. White lives do matter. I think about John Brown. This should not be a condemnation of Kanye. When we see white lives matter, we need to talk about particular white lives that do matter. Lives like Tom Hayden, who helped found the Port Huron Project and who was an anchor, one of the most important anchors in the civil rights movement. I think of Tom Hayden. I think of John Brown. I think of Viola Liuzzo, who was in the civil rights movement, who was attacked for being in the civil rights movement. I think of countless individuals who gave. I think of William Lloyd Garrison. I think of conductors of the Underground Railroad who were white, who helped Black people to freedom. White lives do matter. And this comes back to the question of, whether racial oppression is primary or class oppression is primary. And I would say it's not racial. We can't get caught up in the okie doke. I think the negative way people are talking about Kanye was evidence to me that you're falling for the okie doke of Kanye losing his black card. No, Kanye is a brilliant American billionaire who knows how to market his product. And that's exactly what he was doing, marketing his product. White lives do matter. Okay. That doesn't mean they're any worse or any better than my life. I know my life is valuable. I don't need to wear a Black Lives Matter shirt. I've never worn one and don't plan to, because I already see it as something that is continuing the exploitation of Black people, that continues to separate Black men from their families, the way that Maroon was separated from his family and put in solitary confinement for over 3 decades. So I'm not into the sloganeering. It's triggering for me because I see, oh, this is supposed to be the cover or the purchasing of somebody else's silence so that the status quo can continue. Because there are many ways that, and you could argue Kanye supports the status quo, but we're not asking the right question or having the right response. Instead, we're falling for the okie doke and just attacking him and saying he's not Black for all these different reasons. Whether he's Black or not is not the issue. White lives do matter, and we have to ask, for what purpose? Your life is mattering for what purpose? Our lives are mattering for what purpose? To continue the status quo, or to really deal, as Maroon said, with the dragon, to deal with the dragon appropriately. So the last piece I want to look at today is the work of Charles Fuller, awesome playwright Charles Fuller, whose work I was introduced to about a decade ago when I watched the film A Soldier's Play. This was a play that was produced by the Negro Ensemble Company, and it was on off-Broadway. It starred Samuel L. Jackson, Denzel Washington, and the playwright this past Monday. I interviewed Charles Fuller in 2011 for WPEB Community Radio. I was working as a host of my own public affairs program where I interviewed various authors, including Dr. Mary Frances Berry, who was in the same city at that time, Philadelphia, as a law professor at UPenn. And in that same year, I interviewed playwright and novelist Charles Fuller, who wrote this incredibly beautiful story called Snatch: The Adventures of David and Me in Old New York. And it's a story set in the antebellum, before the Civil War time in New York in 1838. And it centers about the story of two boys, teenage boys named David and Charles, who find themselves in the throes of a criminal enterprise, being confronted with that enterprise and then planning to stop it by rescuing those who have been kidnapped to be sent down south to slavery. So it's a story historically that is rooted in a way similar to Solomon Northup's story, which was turned into a film. Chiwetel Ejiofor unforgettably played Solomon Northup in 12 Years a Slave. The story of Northup is that he moved from New York to Washington, and in Washington, D.C., playing the violin under the auspices he was told he was going to play the violin, ended up being kidnapped and sent to Louisiana. This is an amazing excerpt I just want to read. This is the end of the story, but it doesn't spoil this excerpt, the power of the story. Frederick Douglass became a famous orator and had written a book entitled Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, written by himself. When David and Me, these are the main characters of the book in their early teens, when David and Me read the book, we didn't find one word about us and the things that happened that day and night in September 1838. We were both happy about that. Our parents were among the first Black people in 5 Points, that's the community in New York, it's Manhattan, that Fuller sets his story, to read the book after Freddie sent them a copy and he had written anything about what we did that night. So, and had he written anything about what we did that night, David says, we would all have been in more trouble than you can imagine. David and Me thank Frederick Douglass to this day. I just like the way that Fuller set the whole story and put his sons, who I believe are David and Charles, the same names as his actual sons, in years old in the same time as Frederick Douglass. It is the compelling, suspenseful, awesome short story that I highly recommend you read. It's called Snatch: The Adventures of David and Me in Old New York. So this concludes my 19th YouTube Live. Thank you so much for joining. Please comment, share, like, and subscribe to my YouTube. Don't hesitate to give to my Cash App, $ Roan Fraser. Support my work. Read Snatch by Charles Fuller. And don't hesitate to read Maroon the Implacable by Russell Maroon Shaw.